All right, this is Ricky,
And this is Brendan.
and you're listening to A Gentleman's Disagreement.
What I wouldn't give for the hope I used to find in a case of lion's head. Folks of different minds, because even though it did not share the pains we share, that American ideal, friends made over arguments in an early morning buzz. Need an early morning buzz.
All right, Brendan, it is Sunday, September 29th, evening here on the East Coast. We've last couple of weeks we've done something a little bit different. Why don't you tell the people what we're getting into today?
Yeah, we're really excited about this episode. We have long said that we have felt tremendously fortunate to have been joined by a number of great guests over the course of our time doing this podcast. And today is really a milestone for us in terms of our guests. For our longtime listeners, it's going to be something a little bit different. If you are a new listener, we're thrilled that you're joining us today. But we have two interviews as part of this episode. And for the first time, we are interviewing a presidential ticket. And that presidential ticket is going to be
Presidential, like for the United States.
I guess if that wasn't clear, thank you for the clarification. So we're going to be joined by Chase Oliver and Mike Maat, who are the Libertarian presidential and vice presidential candidates for president. They will show up on 47 ballots, 47 state ballots, and you can obviously write them in on the other three states. But when you go in to vote for president in, I guess, about 5 weeks at this point, Chase and Mike are going to be one of the candidates, and they were exceptionally grateful, exceptionally generous with their time in joining us. So just to give a little kind of context to this episode, we interviewed Mike about 10 days ago last week, and then we interviewed Chase this week about 3 days ago. And so we have kind of two separate interviews happening today. We decided to go with Chase's interview first and then Mike's interview. But there will be times during Chase's interview where we'll reference the Mike interview. But it's really just kind of an editorial decision. We figured we'd lead with the presidential candidate and then go to the vice presidential candidate. But again, Ricky, these conversations were awesome. I almost can't articulate how grateful that I feel, that I think we feel, that Chase and Mike gave us so much of their time and their experiences and their perspectives. And I'm also just really excited for our listeners to get to hear their thoughts.
Yeah, I don't think there's much more to say on that one.
Yeah, so before we jump into those interviews, a reminder to everyone on the podcast is brought to you by the hardworking craftsmen over at Cannon Hill Woodworking. They've been building handcrafted, high-end custom tables and desks in Boston since 2018. That's Cannon with two N's. You can check them out on Instagram or visit them online at www.cannonhillwood.com. Ricky, with the Libertarian ticket on tonight's episode, I have a pun that I hope is somewhat in the Libertarian mindset. So, one is a piece of wood like a king.
Don't know, Brendan. When is it?
When it's a ruler. It obviously, kings and monarchy and big government and authoritarianism is antithetical to everything that the libertarians believe in, and we're going to get a heavy dose of that tonight. So without further ado, let's bring on Chase, and then we'll bring on Mike. All right, we are now really humbled and honored to be joined by Chase Oliver. Chase is a 39-year-old libertarian activist living down in Atlanta who is the nominee of the Libertarian Party for the 2024 United States presidential election. Chase is a champion of the rights of the individual against the growing power of the state. He began his political activism opposing the war in Iraq under George Bush, aligning with the Libertarian Party after an encounter at the Atlanta Pride Festival in 2010. I hope you've heard of Chase because he's running for president, but the name might also ring a bell because back in 2022, he made a little bit of a name for himself when he ran for the U.S. Senate in Georgia, where he debated the incumbent Senator Raphael Warnock and Herschel Walker's empty podium. He was widely credited with and criticized for causing the runoff election between Warnock and Walker. In one of the positions he advocates for is the adoption of ranked choice voting, which is near and dear to Ricky and I's hearts, to avoid future runoffs like the one between Warnock and Walker. Your website, Chase, quotes Rolling Stone, which dubbed you, quote, the most influential libertarian in America. But personally, I think that the quote on your Wikipedia page is even better, which is from the Gazette in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, which described you as, quote, pro-gun, pro-police reform, pro-choice, libertarian who is, quote, armed and gay, which I think is a phenomenal quote.
Yeah, I think there's a good headline, and thank you for having me, and look forward to speaking with y'all and to your audience today. And yeah, it's a great opportunity to reach out. So thank you guys for having me on.
Like I said, pleasure is all ours. So we spent a lot of time when we talked to Mike last week talking kind of big picture wise and like systemically in the role of third parties and why third parties have maybe struggled to break through historically and even in this session in this election. And if you want to touch on any of that stuff, we'd love to hear it. But I more want to talk about tonight with you of like, what would an Oliver-ter Maat administration look like, right? And one of the where I want to start actually is with criminal justice reform. And so on your website, first line it says, quote, our criminal justice system is broken and needs a radical overhaul. And I think a perfect example of that is what happened with Marcellus Williams over the course of this week and over the past few years. So I'd like to just throw it to you as who is Marcellus Williams? Why should people care about him? How does his case exemplify what you're trying to say about criminal justice reform?
Yeah, so if folks aren't familiar, Marcellus Williams, the case out in Missouri where he was convicted of a crime, a murder in 2001 is when he was convicted, given the death penalty. And for the last 23 years, there have been numerous occasions where questions have come up as to whether he was actually guilty of that crime. A lot of circumstantial evidence have been questioned. There had been, lots of DNA evidence that had been kind of muddied and made, didn't really point to a conviction. And so many people, including the prosecutors who are involved in the case, as well as the family of the victim, had requested a stay of execution in this case. And both the attorney general and the governor of the state of Missouri kind of ignored those pleas. And now Marcellus Williams, as of yesterday, was put to death by the state. And it's just one example of just how irresponsive the criminal justice system is to the needs of those who have been victimized by crime and are not wanting to see someone else be put to death by the state. But even prosecutors themselves, when they see new evidence being put forward, the difficulty of bringing that new evidence to light and allowing it to reverse a conviction. And too many times now we've seen people who later were exonerated, put to death. And that's one of the reasons why we in the Libertarian Party, as part of our platform, oppose the death penalty, because one person would be too many. And, most of the rest of the world has actually outlawed capital punishment. It's like ourselves, China, Saudi Arabia, Iran, a few other people we might not want to be friendly with. And then the rest of the world, like our allies and friends and neighbors around the world, have outlawed this practice. And I think we need to join them in doing so to prevent the next Marcellus Williams. I do think life in prison is enough of a punishment for somebody that we don't have to rely on the state to remove someone's life. And if we give the state the power to take someone's life away, it ultimately gives the state the power to take your life away, depending on the extenuating circumstances that they deem. And so as someone who wants to limit state power, I have to want to see an end to the death penalty. And that's just one of many numerous justice reforms we need to see. But I think it's a very important one in the wake of what is actually, we're seeing 5 different executions back to back to back to back to back, and including one in Alabama where they're using nitrogen gas as the means of execution, which has been shown to be an extremely cruel way to kill someone. And so I think we need to have advocates who speak up, and I'm happy to be the Libertarian candidate who right now can speak up for ending the death penalty.
I really appreciate that because, like you said, it's not an issue that nationally is getting a ton of attention. And one of the reasons is because not enough people are talking about it. So when you have someone like yourself that does have a following and access to media who brings this stuff up, it's important. And I imagine that's one of the reasons you wanted to run in the first place, to get some of ideas and issues like to be in more front and center and to be talked about in a way that just aren't when you have only two parties controlling the conversation.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's kind of where I got my start in politics, was being an on the street activist. And so I feel like a lot of times, maybe those, activist level issues, things like the death penalty, other criminal justice reforms, things like the right to privacy and fighting the national security state, these things kind of never translate from the streets to the political sphere because there's that barrier there from Republicans and Democrats in a lot of cases. And as a libertarian, I'm happy to kind of take that activism spirit and kind of thrust it into the politics in a way that maybe you're not seeing from the major parties out of either fear, or maybe it's because they're beholden to like certain lobbyist groups or special interests. But libertarians, broadly speaking, we stand more on principle than on like who's throwing money towards our campaign coffers. And so sometimes it allows for that, kind of that brutal honesty that maybe we just don't have in Washington, D.C. as much as we need to. It's another reason why we need more than two parties, certainly.
Yeah, I think that's it's almost like an ombudsman that's able to sit back there and kind of point out flaws and hypocrisy in both sides of the aisle. And Ricky and I have talked about this for a long time, of like the lack of principle. It's all about keeping power, and the best way to keep power is often to sow fear, and in terms of voting for the other guy or the other woman, where it becomes less and less about ideas. And so it's refreshing in some ways to see and hear a campaign that's running on ideas.
Yeah, well, and that's something you have to get over. When you're running third party, that's one of the greatest challenges you have to have, right? Is overcoming that fear that, hey, if I'm voting for you, I'm helping the bad person win. Which to me, I understand it, and voters are conditioned to feel that. Certainly by both parties. You have the Democrats saying like democracy is on the ballot, and you have the Republican candidate. Simultaneously, Trump is saying, hey, you need to cool this rhetoric. It's creating violence. But also, she's the worst vice president that there's ever been. She's destroying this country, right? He uses quite hyperbolic rhetoric as well. And so for me, that's one of the challenges I have to have as I travel around the country, is let people know, like, if you continue to vote out of that fear, you're going to continue to get lower and lower expectations from your candidates. It's going to continue to devolve into lesser and lesser important things and more debates about golf scores or crowd sizes or what have you, instead of real substantive policy debates. I can tell you, if I was in the debate stage with Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, there would have been a lot more substantive policy being talked about and political theory than what we get out of our politics today.
Well, let's talk about some policy then, specifically foreign policy, because one of the things that Ricky in particular has bemoaned for the last few years, but really the last few decades, is how the homogenization of Democratic and Republican foreign policy. That it just doesn't seem, I mean, you're slapping a different label on largely the same policies that we're seeing. So again, if this was an Oliver administration, Oliver-ter Maat administration, what does foreign policy look like under that?
Well, it starts with changing our foreign policy aims from being where we're trying to export our values militaristically, using the bomb, the bullet, the drone, expanding bases around the world, to we're actually reducing our military footprint as much as possible and actually replacing that with the diplomatic footprint, with the free trade footprint, with actually trying to engage our neighbors diplomatically. Something Barack Obama promised to do in 2008 and never did was he said, I'll engage with any head of state directly without precondition. If I were the president of the United States, that would be a promise I'd be willing to make, because I think it's important to try diplomacy first before you ever think about a military solution. And it involves, looking for avenues of agreement with our neighbors, and it looks for reducing, again, that military footprint. So we're not, kind of engaging the world at the tip of a spear, like, you better be with us or this spear is going to go through you, like that. And I feel like certainly since 2001, and when Bush said, if you're not with us, you're with the terrorists kind of mindset, that we've had this kind of unilateral, you better be doing what we want you to do or you're our enemy. I think that is not a nuanced enough view of foreign. Sorry, I dropped off. Can you guys hear me again?
Yeah, I think you actually ended at a perfect spot. But yeah, we're good.
Oh, excellent. Well, thunderstorms be thunderstorming. So as
That's
long as we're recording still, we're good to go.
we're
We
good. All
are.
right.
Yeah, no, I think that is I Brent and I have discussed how that oddly enough that's like kind of an element that Trump in sort of an end around way has introduced into more of like the mainstream political sphere. I think it does resonate well with anti-war Democrats. One of the things that I've always kind of been curious about as a libertarian candidate is that I feel like the Libertarian Party is traditionally like a home for disaffected Republicans, many of who are small government, fiscally conservative, but are not following what's going on the social policy side. I wonder, is that how you see some of the Libertarian Party? And if not, if it's more broad than that, like where are the main sort of areas of congruence with disaffected Democrats that you're seeing?
Yeah, so I do think it's a little bit of a bigger tent than just that, but certainly there's a large number of libertarians who kind of came to us from traditionally voting Republican or feeling like maybe the Republican Party was that good first fit for them. Because I was such an anti-war guy early on in my political journey, and George Bush was president, that just wasn't going to happen for me. And so I just kind of made the Democratic Party fit, right? And I think that's where, similarly, you're going to see a lot of strain maybe coming from the Democratic side of things, which is a lot of young voters who just don't want to see the United States militaristic foreign policy, particularly on college campuses. We're seeing that with regards to what's going on in Gaza. And so I do think that there's a large well of voters, particularly from Gen Z, that we can draw over into the Libertarian Party if we market ourselves to them in a correct way, which is to say that we are welcoming to all kinds of people from all walks of life, um, every color of the rainbow, so to speak. And that's because Gen Z is broadly representative of that diversity. They're the most diverse generation that's ever existed in America, both in terms of racial identity, faith identity, socioeconomic background, LGBTQ identification. And so it's important for us to not only to be reaching out to that traditional voter base of those, disaffected, maybe traditional Republican voters who just see lack of action on fiscal policy or on gun policy or on business and getting taxes low, but to also be able to reach out to those traditionally Democratic voters who are concerned about things like emerging entrepreneurship in small businesses, particularly in urban areas, removing regulations around the housing market so we can get more houses built and so we can lower the cost of housing. Maybe choice in education, which is maybe not as a traditional Democratic Party byline, but more and more people who are living in Democratic city centers want better schools for their kids and are just not getting that from the traditional public education system. And so there are areas to definitely draw from all across the political spectrum. And I believe the Libertarian Party can be a very big tent. Everyone from that constitutionalist who just wants us to get more in line with constitutional governance, all the way down to those who are like me. I'm a minarchist, but even beyond me, there's anarchists in the Libertarian Party who think, hey, let's keep reducing government until we get down to no government. That's exactly what we want. Well, until we get down to some sort of limited government, that entire spectrum of people is one big tent that can work together to start chopping government down to size, piece by piece, step by step, brick by brick. It doesn't happen overnight. And that's the kind of coalition that I think libertarians need to build across the country to really rise up as a viable third party option, in addition to advocating changes for the way we vote, things like ranked choice voting and ballot access reforms. I'm an advocate of the Voter Bill of Rights on my website. It's a great piece of legislation, great policy prescription, pieces of legislation we could pass that would also expand that. But there's definitely a broad electorate that we can draw from if we do it right. And I'm trying my best.
So maybe I can hone in a little bit on the education piece of things. Brendan here was a former middle school teacher for a long time, so school choice is really very important to him, and I'm actually coming around to it, having been ardently public education or nothing for a long time. I think one of the things that Democratic voters often worry about is the sort of state control over education, right? You see if you're a Democrat living here in Massachusetts, you see what's going on in Florida, and you're like, I don't know if, disbanding the Department of Education and giving it all back to the states makes great sense. How do you respond to something like that?
Well, I would advocate actually, of course, I want to get rid of the Department of Education federally, but what I would like to see in a lot of states, and I think would be the best path forward, and I would certainly use the bully pulpit if I were president on this, is to advocate, don't even reduce it down to the states. Take that funding directly to individuals and their parents. Fund the student, not the system. And if you live in a place that has really great public schools as of today, you'll just continue funding those schools. You'll just take the taxpayer allocation, you'll fund those schools because they already have buildings and bus routes and the logistics that you're already looking for. They already have a stadium for the sports team and whatever. But if you're in a place that has really badly performing schools, like I live in Atlanta, not long ago, we had a huge crisis where school teachers and administrators were busted for cheating on test scores to basically up their funding. They weren't interested in educating the kids, they were interested in colluding to cheat. And if you're a parent there, you might say, hey, I want more options. I want something better. I want a better way to educate my kids, whether that's a private school, a religious school, another model of school that maybe teaches a different way that can get through to your students, your child better, or hey, maybe you're a two-parent household and that taxpayer allocation can actually afford you to be able to stay home and home educate your child. Whatever the option is, you can find what fits best for you and your family and your personal situation. And of course, educational entrepreneurs, they'll be going into those spaces like the city of Atlanta and providing schools and saying, this is a better way to educate your kids. And not only is that better for the student and the parent, in my opinion, that's actually better for educators. I know a lot of teachers who became public school teachers because they wanted to have that. They wanted to be that amazing teacher they had in school that inspired them to become a lifelong learner. And then they get the job and they're like, oh my God, I'm so restricted by this curriculum. I'm stuck teaching a very bad way. I know I could do it better if I could do X, Y, or Z. Well, in the world of education freedom, educators can market themselves saying, hey, I want to teach it this way and I think it will perform this well. And they can actually see what works best. And in that world, what works best will get adopted by other organizations. What does not work will fall off by the wayside. And we won't be stuck in a cycle of having underperforming schools, particularly in areas where the government, whether it's the state government or the federal government, just aren't paying enough attention. Let parents pay attention to their kids more and what their kids are learning and what their kids are being exposed to in education. I think you'll have ultimately better outcomes all around in the long run. Will it be perfect? No. But is the system we're working with perfect? No. And I think to expect perfection is making the perfect the enemy of the good.
Preach, Chase. Ricky, if that didn't convince you even further, I don't know what would. But so it's the marketplace of ideas, right? It's which I've always come back to. It's like let the market kind of decide. Even in education, when you take the market forces and individual choice out of things, things tend to get worse, in my opinion. So you mentioned earlier, like on a global scale, one of the tenets of your foreign policy would be free trade. I kind of push Mike on this too. That idea is increasingly falling out of favor, it appears, here in the United States on both parties. And that's been really interesting to watch, where sometimes Ricky and I talk about how the ends of the spectrum end up being more of a circle, where you have people on the far left and far right whose ideas of protectionism and economic populism and really economic nationalism have risen to the forefront of both parties. Do you feel like you're losing that battle a little bit in terms of the benefits of free trade?
Yeah, I think it's saddening to see that there's not a major party, other than the Libertarian Party in this election that's really advocating for those things. I feel like I'm the only free market candidate, not just beyond Trump and Harris, but Stein and West and others. Like, I feel like the Libertarian Party is solely standing for that. I think we need to educate people on the power of free trade, and from a practical standpoint, I worked for years in the maritime shipping industry. I understand exactly what it takes to get, say, a garment from a textile mill in Vietnam to your store shelf at Walmart, right? Like, I know how many people it goes along that supply chain and how many jobs that creates. Think about it. Sure, it starts in Vietnam, it's manufactured there, and then it gets on a boat. but it gets unloaded by longshoremen in the United States and then put onto a truck or a train that's moved to the United States. And then it ends up in a warehouse that's run by, American workers. Then it gets in another truck that goes to the Walmart that's, run by American workers, and eventually goes to an American person. And protectionism, tariffs, these things add to the cost of that. It adds to the end cost of the user, which is you, which is me, which is an American business. It does not punish China to put a tariff on Chinese goods. It punishes Americans. It basically is a tax on each and every American. And we need to educate voters on this. We need to educate voters that protectionism does not work. There's a wonderful meme I've shared before. And it has three people. One person makes a perfect square, one person can make a perfect triangle, one person can make a perfect circle. And if you're trading freely with one another, everybody gets the perfect goods. But if you restrict yourself, well, you only have perfect squares here. You have crappy triangles and crappy circles. It just doesn't work. And so we need to try to do our best to educate voters across the spectrum. But yeah, it's really lonely. But maybe we need more people to run for office who, work in that supply chain, but actually see the value in free trade. I know I do. I know the people I worked with in my office who are, really good jobs, providing really great standard of living for their families, work in that industry, and we need to push for it. And by the way, one thing you're not hearing about in the mainstream media or from Trump or from Harris right now is the fact that the largest union at the ports is about to go on strike in the Gulf ports and along the Atlantic coast, and that can disrupt trade. Like every single day that strike happens, they're looking at a strike likely happening now. And for every day that strike goes on, you're basically backlogging 5 or 6 days worth of productivity as we're going into the holiday season, like as we need the most goods being moved. This is going to have a major effect on the economy right before the election. And no one is talking about it, of course, because nobody has that, working man's view of it. Maybe it's because of the industry I'm in that I'm paying a little bit more attention to it, but I wish more politicians and members of the media would.
Certainly. We've talked a lot about inflation on this podcast because I attribute a lot of inflation to government policies and procedures. And Ricky has, I think, consistently and at times rightly pushed back a little bit and said that a lot of the inflation that we saw over the past few years are due to things like supply chain disruptions as a result of the pandemic and the outcomes of that. And it triggered this question for me because you're just talking about if we have a strike down by the port workers, that's going to lead to supply chain disruptions, which could lead to inflation. So curious, again, going back to a potential like Oliver-ter Maat administration, how would you combat inflation? Like what would that actually look like in terms of economic policies?
Well, I think we need to look at that there is not just one cause of inflation. Supply chain is certainly part of it. And the pandemic was kind of a once in a 100-year kind of a thing. But absent that, the other primary driver of inflation that was happening before the pandemic and is now happening after it is debt and deficit spending. The fact that we are printing trillions of dollars a year out of thin air. And when we do that, it actually devalues the dollar that's in our pocket. And that's why you're feeling a lot of the pinch. It's not just corporate greed. If it were, it would be explainable, but, corporations were greedy 5 years ago. They're going to be greedy 5 years from now. They're driven by the bottom line, the profit motive. They're going to find the price equilibrium that gives them the most bang for their buck. And when you devalue the dollar, it makes them have to drive up prices to meet that equilibrium. And so for me, the best economic policy we can do is to start pushing ourselves towards a balanced budget where we're not actually adding to the debt and deficit anymore. It's certainly the goal that I would push for as president. I would veto any budget that isn't balanced and challenge Congress to actually have to override me or come to the table with a plan that actually gets ourselves out of this debt hole. Because I think that's the biggest thing for me, economically.
But what is that like? How do you get a balanced budget?
So a lot of that is cutting a lot of the sacred cows that's in government, reducing basically subsidies and deductions out of the tax code, flattening the tax code somewhat to make up for that. But you also have to cut out a lot of government programs, redundancies. You have to find basically any area where there's two agencies doing the same thing. Immediately you have to cut one of those agencies out. Like first thing, that's cutting the fat. But even more so, getting our government back into its constitutional role, 9th and 10th Amendment applying. There's a lot of things the federal government does they ought not to do. We should be either block granting back to the states or just not having us take an approach at all at the federal level. And the biggest driver of that is our Pentagon spending from the discretionary budget side. We could cut 50% of the Pentagon out and still be the most, readily available kick-ass fighting force in the world that could take on any opponent that comes our way. But, absent that, I think the other greatest thing is entitlements, which is Social Security and Medicare. And I actually have a plan that would allow current retirees to retire on Social Security, but get us a path off of that program, take it off of the federal books.
This is where I think libertarians lose people, right? It's like you start talking about cutting defense spending in half, you start talking about cutting entitlements, and you're losing people on like both ends of the spectrum here. So, I mean, you obviously know that. How do you combat the initial kind of resistance to those sorts of ideas?
Well, I think one of the ways, particularly with Social Security, is we have to educate folks that just because libertarians don't want the government to do something doesn't mean we don't want it to get done. We want people to have a safe and secure retirement. Our case is that doing that through a Social Security program, which doesn't give you a better return for your investment, is just a really badly way to do that. It's a bad way to organize that retirement. And in fact, if you could save the employee contribution that comes out of your paycheck every week and throw that into a mutual fund or an IRA, or heck, even in just the S&P 500, you're going to get a better return over the long term than you're going to get from Social Security benefits. And so we have to make that case to people that there's actually a better way to save for retirement than to insist on a government program. And that's a hard case to make to some people. And it's one of the reasons why my Social Security plan is not an instant light switch turning it off. My parents live on a fixed income. They don't have the ability to save into an IRA right now. They're already retired. And there are people who are near retirement that just don't have the time to save. So you have to preserve the benefits for them while making the change for younger workers like myself. Maybe that's because I'm the under 40 candidate that I'm kind of thinking long term for myself. But if I was allowed my employee contribution back, I could save for myself better than I'm going to get out of Social Security if I was just to put that into my retirement fund that I already have through my work. So I just think that there is a better way to save for ourselves. We have to make that case. So we're not trying to throw grandma over a cliff. We're trying to actually provide younger workers a better way to have a better life when they themselves are grandmas, so to speak. As far as defense spending, we have to make the case there's just a lot of bloat. There's a lot of waste, and just that we don't need the military industrial complex, if for no other reason that we're not fighting the same kind of wars we used to fight. We don't need to be building so many tanks and planes. The modern warfare in the future is going to be taking place online. It's going to be, it's going to be digital, espionage and fighting, fighting the war online. It's not going to necessarily be land wars like we're used to in our past history. So we need to maybe modernize the DoD, readjust our policy there. And we can do that while saving a lot of taxpayer money and quit bloating the military industrial complex. Boeing can find other things to build. Raytheon can find other things to do. We don't have to continue to fund them through military industrial complex welfare.
Yeah. Boeing has enough things that they could be working on. I think this also just sort of brings up one of these just the broader question of how do we solve for this issue of what's in our long-term interest may not necessarily be in our short-term interest, or are you saying some of these changes, which are kind of seismic in many ways, can be done in a frictionless way if we do it right? Or is there some of that we are going to have to change the way that we think, and that may lead to some near-term disruption to put us on the path for a better future? How does that work in present politics when everyone is trying to? I mean, Brendan and I have talked about this as the free soda or free lunch election, where you want no tax on tips. Whatever is the flavor of the day, everybody gets it, and that's how we're gonna proceed. But obviously, in the long term, that doesn't make a lot of sense.
Oh yeah, well, first and foremost, yeah, Boeing can do other things. I fly 2 or 3 times a week, so please, Boeing, please make sure the planes are good to go. And I can't say I've not had a bad experience at any of them, so I'm just going to say that. I still think it's the safest way to travel. But you're right, there's going to be disruption. I think we need to be honest about that. I tell people all the time, there's going to be pain. There will always be pain when you do a major change, but there would have been less pain if we had done this 15 or 20 years ago. there's going to be more pain if we do it 15 or 20 years from now. And eventually it's going to be inevitable that we have to change the way we're doing things. If we continue to run trillion-dollar deficits year over year over year over year, there will be a point when there's no turning back and there's no way to stop what's coming. And that will be a much greater amount of pain and disruption to our economy and to the American way of life than if we go ahead and change the priority now and put the brakes on. It's a question of, are we going to hit the wall going 5 miles an hour or 50 miles an hour? What do you think is going to cause more damage? Should we put the brakes on, or should we keep our foot on the accelerator? But there's going to be pain. We're past the point of where pain won't exist if we readjust ourselves. And I'm willing to be, honest about that and thinking long term. Again, maybe it's because I'm under 40 and I'm not 80 years old. I'm not Joe Biden. I'm not Donald Trump. I'm only thinking about what I can get for the next 2 years or 4 years. I'm thinking about me and what it's going to be like for me to be retiring in the next 30 years. What it's going to be like for my nephews and nieces to grow up in the world. Do I want to make sure they have a world where they have a chance at prosperity, or do I want to keep my foot on the accelerator? And so I think part of that is just being honest with the American people, which you're not getting from Harris. You're not getting from Trump. You don't get that from the Democrats and Republicans because they're already in power. And it's more about them preserving power than it is about them being honest and frank with what's going on. They would much rather give you, bread and circuses, complain again about golf scores and make up lies, xenophobic lies about people eating pets in Springfield, which I'm going to be heading to Springfield, Ohio, in the coming days. And I look forward to going there to be an honest person and to dispel a lot of the BS, because that's the distraction. And once you dispel the distraction, we can talk about the things we need to talk about. And the longer we stop having those conversations, the longer we stall, kick the can down the road, the way more painful it's going to be. And so maybe we need truth tellers, and we need more of them. And we need more millennials running, because we're at, and I think part of the reason why I'm expecting that pain is I'm a millennial. We already get a ton of it. We're already being piled on. We just don't want it to pile onto the next generation. Keep putting it on our shoulders, man. Put the pain on us. Don't put it on Gen Z and Gen Alpha, because they didn't have anything to do with it. We didn't have anything to do with it either. It was our boomer parents that ran up the tab. But we're willing to take the hit so the next generations don't. And I think that truly is, what we're going to be known for, Gen Xers and millennials, is standing up for what's right, even when it hurts us, because it's not going to hurt the next generation. And maybe we need more honest people in government for that.
I don't think it's a maybe. That's not a maybe. That's a 100%. That was a heck of a rant. I think that, get me all fired up. That was awesome. I guess, Chase, if you mentioned you're going to Springfield, if people who just heard that are as kind of inspired as I think Ricky and I both were just couldn't wait to jump in after that. Where could they go if they wanted to follow you, to learn more about you, to potentially contribute in various ways to your campaign?
Yeah, so you can go to votechaseoliver.com. From there, you can check out our events tabs to see where we're going to be. You can volunteer if you want to join the team as we go into these last few days in the election. The get out the vote efforts are starting right now. So if you want to be a text banker or a door knocker, now is the time to jump into the campaign team. And of course, we need that support. We need people to help put the literature in the hands. We need to help people fund those text banking and phone banking operations. So if you want to donate to the campaign, you can do all that through votechaseoliver.com. And of course, in social media, if you want to pay attention to what we're doing and where we're at, Chase for Liberty, at Chase for Liberty. That's spelling out the word for. We don't use the number here. Chase for Liberty on all the major social media platforms. And in fact, we just had one of our TikTok videos pass 1 million views, which is awesome. Right. And in the last 2 weeks, we've had almost over 1.5 million views on TikTok. So we're really growing on that platform, which is big for Gen Z. So we're hoping to reach out to more and more young voters that way. But follow us wherever you get your social media. And of course, go right to that website, votechaseoliver.com, to join the campaign directly.
Well, awesome. Go ahead, Ricky.
I was going to say, before we let you go, Chase, something that we have thought about just for third parties in general, but curious your view on it. What does success look like in November for Chase Oliver and the Libertarian?
Yeah, absolutely. So you run to win, because if you're not doing it, you're not doing it right. You have to run to win. But absent the absolute victory of winning in November, there's lots of victories across the country you can win. We can win ballot access in states all over the country where our vote determination allows ease of ballot access, so more and more libertarians can run in the future. We can win things like major party status that gets us access to things like the debate stage, or in the case of Iowa, I was the first Libertarian candidate to ever speak at the Des Moines Register, the presidential candidate to speak at the Des Moines Register soapbox, the Iowa State Fair, things like that, because you get increased media attention when you get that major party status. And of course, we can help elect local libertarians in races all over the country. There's fantastic candidates. I'm going to be heading to El Paso soon to meet a guy that I challenged him to knock on 3,000 doors. And he's already knocked on 6,000. And so when I tell you that we have fired up candidates across the country and I want to go out there and support them, that's another kind of victory. So and then there's also that kind of abstract victory, which is, hey, if the two-party system hears some good ideas out of my mouth and they steal them from us, that's a win without even winning. And so there's a lot of ways we can achieve victory without even that outright victory of going into the White House, though I desperately want to win so I can do the work and radically change this country.
Certainly we need more people like you, if not you yourself. So yeah, go follow Chase. Chase, again, we're so grateful and appreciative of your time tonight and all of the work that you're doing to try to give people real choice in this election. So thank you for being you and the work that you're doing.
Peace, love, and liberty to you guys.
Yeah. See you, Chase. Thank you. All right, we are now thrilled to welcome Mike Maat onto the program. Mike began his professional career in finance and economics. From 1992 through 2002, his work included time with banks as a commercial loan officer, in the White House Office of Management and Budget as a financial economist, and as a consulting economist to 3 other federal and international agencies in the field of economic development. In 2002, he started a professional education business for bank executives, which he successfully ran until 2009. And then from 2010 to 2021, Mike served as a police officer in the Broward County of Florida. Mike is an avid traveler. He has taught economics at 3 universities and substituted at dozens of Broward public schools, which, as a former public school teacher myself, I very much appreciate. But even more, like, no one appreciates substitute teachers more than actual teachers, I think. He has a BS in aeronautical engineering and an MBA from RPI and an MS and PhD in economics from the George Washington University. Most importantly, he has 1 wife, 2 kids, 2 stepdaughters, 2 dogs, and 1 truck. Mike, welcome to the program.
Well, thank you very much. That was probably the worst 60 seconds of your viewers' day. I must say that no one appreciates full-time teachers like a substitute as well. When I was substitute teaching, it was an odd circumstance. One of the teachers got pregnant, and she was out on maternity leave, and I picked up, right? And this was not the usual day or two. This turned into, it was more than a month. I don't think it was 2 months, but it was a whole bunch of, it felt like 3 years, right? I had no idea. And this is after having worked as a substitute teacher for more than a year, part-time, here and there. But after having done dozens and dozens of shifts, I had no idea how much work there was involved for a full-time teacher until she went out on maternity leave. And all of a sudden I'm making lesson plans, talking to the parents.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. And you had to get to know the kids. A substitute teacher can just walk out, hey, it's 3:30, have a nice life, right? But with when you're the regular teacher, like, you have to know a little bit about what's going on. I found it wholly annoying for the amount of money that they were paying, the amount of work, and the amount of brain space. One of the things that really, I don't think people think about is how much brain space it occupies even when you're not there. You think it's just one of those jobs that you don't walk away from and forget.
No, for sure. And honestly, I missed it. I loved it. But even last year, Ricky, you and I have talked about this, where people have asked, like, so now I'm a lawyer and people have asked about that. And I'm like, this is the easiest job I've ever had. And people are like, what? And it's like what you were saying. It's the mental space, but it's also the emotional space. It's like draining to really be present and do a good job as a teacher.
Oh, no, absolutely. Because you care. See, now, if you would just not give a damn, it would be a lot easier.
Sure.
By the way, I'm not going to pass on to your clientele currently that you find this job easy, because I know what that implies. I know that you didn't really mean it in the way that it came off. But look, one of the reasons, you're really a poster child for this. I don't know if this is what your viewers don't know, that before you hit the record button, the three of us were chatting about how sometimes you two disagree. And I started arguing with you about maybe you don't really disagree all that much. But I'm interested in your reaction to the following, because you are a poster child for one of the major reasons why I am so pro-choice for public schools, which is we lose good public school I actually don't have any data that suggests you were any good at it, but we do lose a lot of good public school teachers, both in terms of them walking away from the job or retiring early, and not becoming school teachers because they want to go into other careers. A major example is, becoming a law student, becoming an attorney, becoming a lawyer, either in the public sector or the private sector, because a lot of the skills are the same, right? You're looking for people who care about people and about their communities, who are articulate. Obviously, I'm not talking necessarily about you, but people who are good people and articulate and smart and care and are good at explaining things and working with people. That's the same profile for a good attorney as for a good teacher. And one of the reasons why I'm so pro-choice, besides the fact that it leads to better educational outcomes, is that it would and will and does in certain areas already bid up the wage rate for good teachers.
Yeah, I mean,
this is something that unions don't understand. Having been a member of a union myself as a cop, I can tell you that unions are completely unaware of this phenomenon.
Well, I mean, you've thrown down the gauntlet here, and Ricky, feel free to hop in, but I'm totally on board with this. I worked at a public charter school here in Boston, and our educational outcomes were phenomenal. We worked with essentially the same kids. It was a lottery system, so we're talking about the same kids, that could go to a traditional public school. Their parents, their families wanted them
in fairness to Ricky's counter argument, you did have a selection bias with your kids, because it was kids whose parents wanted them to be involved and be there and that sort of thing.
Yeah,
I know that's what Ricky is dying to say, so let me jump in and point that out.
No, that's totally fair, right? It's while ostensibly demographically it's the same group of kids, there's someone in their lives that put them in a lottery for this, which I think is a fair, because we take that for granted. Not everyone has that in their lives. Fair. All right, so I think I'll actually use this kind of to spin us off a little bit. Let's go back. Early 90s, you're working in the White House Office of Management and Budget. That's in the George H.W. Bush administration. Bush famously runs on read my lips, no new taxes. You are an economist who I'm sure, I don't want to presume to know what you were thinking 30 years ago, but probably kind of agreed with something like that. So can you talk about a little bit of your experience kind of working within the system and how that maybe drove you away from the system in some ways?
Sure. Well, first of all, him going back on that pledge made my head explode. If you're a young, fiscally conservative economist and a Republican, at least at the time I thought I was a Republican. And in fairness, I thought my boss's boss was a Republican too. I just hasten to add that, because I didn't want you to think that it's like he and I were sitting in the Oval Office, kicking ideas back and forth. I was the lowest of the my boss was actually one of the lowest. My boss's boss was low on the totem pole. So understand that. But yeah, if you were a young, fiscally conservative Republican, that was kind of a big deal. And I think that one might argue that in those days, the Republican Party was more fiscally conservative than it is now. But more importantly, it was more fiscally conservative than the Democratic Party. I'm not sure that anyone would argue that the Republican Party is particularly fiscally conservative today, right? It is neither fiscally conservative nor is it terribly pro-market, right?
Not
And
anymore.
so, either way you look at it, from the standpoint of keeping government out of certain decisions or just keeping the government in check in terms of its scale and scope, the Republican Party has really let down fiscal conservatives over the last few decades.
Yeah, preach, Mike. Yeah.
This is a discussion that we have often. How much, or I guess how much importance do you give to sort of the fiscally conservative movement today? Kind of knowing what you know now of the last 30 years of, let's say, neither party being fiscally conservative, spending freely either through tax cuts or increased spending, right?
How much importance in terms of importance to what?
I guess importance.
I know how I'm going to answer it. I'm just curious about your question.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess, one of the things that I pointed out to Brendan is that, the last maybe like 4 years notwithstanding, we've done a ton of spending. You haven't seen the inflation that people are generally worried about. You obviously don't have this balanced budget.
We've had over 20% inflation since the administration took over, right?
Since the Biden administration took over?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of depends on exactly how you want to draw that line, because you've had wage growth also over that time with relatively low unemployment.
I'm not saying Joe Biden is bad compared to any other politician. I'm just pointing out that we have had a hell of a large amount of inflation.
And I think that is totally fair to point out, and I think it's important to point out. Maybe I would challenge how much government policies are driving that inflation versus
all of it. There's no such thing as inflation that's driven by anything but government.
Okay, so I think that's an interesting point. How do you see what Biden has done?
By the way, that's not an opinion. That's just, that's like saying the sun comes up in the east and sets in the west. That's just how it works. Inflation is a monetary phenomenon created by the Federal Reserve System creating too much money. It's not Biden's fault. It's the Federal Reserve System does this, but the Fed felt like it was under pressure to create a great deal of money coming through the COVID regime in order to avoid a deep depression. Now, one might argue that they were either right or wrong. But they felt that it was important to pump all this money into the system to avoid a bad depression. And that's where the inflation came from. It wasn't Biden's fault per se. Neither was all the spending. I mean, Trump spent just as much, right?
Yeah. Well, I guess in terms of priorities for you, how much does getting inflation under control by either cutting back on programs or increasing tax revenue rank in terms of sort of importance for the overall health of the system, let's call it?
Sure. It's important to understand that the administration doesn't control inflation, that the Federal Reserve System does. And the Fed comes under pressure from some of the things the administration does, but the Fed is independent both in a legalistic sense, but also for the most part in a political sense, particularly if you were to compare it to the other parts of the government over which either the executive branch or the legislative branch have some influence, and relative to other countries in which the central bank really is under a lot of influence and a great deal more pressure from their executive branch than in the United States. We do have two big problems with our economy. Well, let's say three big buckets, three categories of problems with our economy in the United States. And this is not relative to other countries. Relative to other countries, we're doing pretty well, right? There are a lot of governments out there that make ours look smart. But relative to what we know works and doesn't work, from sort of an academic or a research or even from a business standpoint, our government does not look very smart. The three big problems we have are, as you pointed out, inflation, the government spending too much, and all the things that the government does to try to change the way that people make decisions, whether that's weird tax policies, weird subsidies, corporate tax, tariffs, all these things that the government does to try to change behavior are, as a whole, extremely inefficient. A few of them are pretty badly inefficient on their own. Things like tariffs and corporate tax really corrode and corrupt the way the economy should work. The big problem with spending is not because it drives inflation per se, which it does to a certain extent, because it puts all this pressure on the Federal Reserve System to buy a lot of the debt that the government issues, and that turns into inflation. But the big problem with the enormous amount of spending that the executive branch of the federal government of the United States engages in is the mounting debt. And the reason that that's a problem, besides the fact that it costs so much money for all of us to service that debt, I don't think most Americans realize that the federal government has borrowed the equivalent of over $100,000 per head for every man, woman, and child in America, which is a very weird statistic if someone were to sit down and think about it. If you had a family of four, that means the government is carrying over $400,000 of debt on your behalf. And someone has to pay all of the interest on that every single year. That's a tremendous amount of money. So, your family might have to kick in, $20,000 a year for nothing more than to service the debt, that was borrowed in order to pay things that have already been paid. That's not adding any value going forward. It's just servicing this debt. The big problem, in addition to that, is that the federal government of the United States is going to collapse. And it's going to collapse before the middle of this century. And when it does, unless there's a serious course correction, which there could be, right? I probably shouldn't say it will collapse. It would collapse in the absence of a serious course correction, no sign of which is in the offing, which is why sometimes I accidentally say it will collapse. But it would collapse if there's no serious course correction in the next couple of decades. There are a lot of people who argue with me and say it's going to be a hell of a lot sooner than that, but nobody in the economics profession argues with me and says, oh no, we've got 40 years to go. Nobody says that. The problem is that it'll cause a bad depression. And that is something that we need to avoid.
Well, sure. In what sense do you mean collapse?
At some point, the government won't be able to service its debt anymore, and it will default on debt, which would collapse the bond market, which depends on the stability provided by bonds issued by the federal government. And that would very likely take down the orderly function of international markets and the US dollar, which would undermine our ability to engage in international trade. And so it would lead to a massive depression that would be very difficult to climb out of if you didn't have working markets and bonds and money.
Okay, so I guess that's two things on that. And I think for some people, not having international markets these days sounds phenomenal. Like you kind of bemoan, and I long have in this program, like these tariffs that have come in, but these tariffs are now, you see them across the two major parties because they are enormously politically popular. So as someone that's running on a, maybe the third major ticket in our country, how do you reconcile this desire seemingly across the spectrum from Americans for more protectionist policies versus your history as an economics, understanding that that actually makes things worse for everybody?
Politicians, in my view, are obliged to be less dumb than they have behaved in the last couple of years.
But politicians need to be elected, right? You need to have a platform that appeals to people.
Politicians have been elected in the past without being so protectionist.
I agree, but I'm saying like the circumstances now have seemingly changed. It seems like both sides.
I don't think that's true.
Then where do you see this rise in economic protectionism coming from then?
I think it comes from having gone through cycles of fear with regard to our economy, acceleratingly. So to your point, yes, that has changed, but it hasn't changed so much in terms of international markets, right? International trade has been increasing, but it has been increasing dramatically since World War II and steadily. And yet we have seen very pro-market oriented Republicans and Democrats elected from time to time. I think this is the first time. I could be wrong about what I'm about to say, so check me. But I don't remember there being two presidential candidates representing the Republican Party and the Democratic Party vying in a tight race for the White House, both of whom are totally pro-tariff. I think that that's worse than usual.
I agree. So I'm saying that, like, how are you pitching people? Because they're not doing this because necessarily they believe in it. They're doing it because that's where the people seem to be. That's going to get them votes. How are you pitching people on a different path?
Well, first of all, I would say that Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, I don't want to sound nasty.
Fit right in.
Neither one of them would be mistaken for well-educated in economics.
Trump got an MBA from the Warren School of Business. I heard that at the debate, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, you heard it from him.
Yeah.
Okay. So let me say that each of them is more vulnerable to populist arguments that don't carry a lot of water in reality.
Okay.
Whereas a guy like Bill Clinton, to intentionally pick a Democrat, was less vulnerable to such silly arguments, in spite of the fact that one might argue that when he was running, might not have been a bad idea to lean into some protectionist ideas. Now, to be fair, he was drawing a tremendous amount of money from Wall Street and didn't want to give up on that. I mean, I'm not accusing him of being a political fool. Nobody would, right?
Oh, no one would do that.
No, no one would do that. But my point is that it is true. Look, you're making an excellent point that needs to be made frequently, which is that politicians are not leaders. Politicians are followers. That's 100% true. But having said that, these particular politicians are particularly bad at being resilient against silly populism.
Okay.
And I think that what we need to point out, to finally get to your question, is that the truth is that if you want to get rich as a country, you need to engage in free international trade, free trade. And to the extent to which that's international, then it is. But you need to be able to engage in free trade. That is the path to growth. It is disruptive, but how do I say, tariffs that are protectionist are only non-disruptive temporarily. You cannot, in the long run, preclude the disruptions in our economy that come from international trade.
Totally agree. So I guess my question is, where do you see your role and Chase's role in this presidential debate then? Like, in terms of just economically?
Telling people the truth and hoping that sometimes they listen.
Do you think there's a market out there for your ideas?
Oh, yes, I do. I'm not sure that that'll be reflected in vote totals, right? For a variety of reasons, not the least of which is that people still do believe that their political decisions, their voting decisions, are short-term in nature. You know, people continue to believe that what they're voting for is who's going to be president the next 4 years, right? People believe that that's what they're voting for when they cast that presidential vote, when the truth is that what you're voting for is a set of ideas to rise or fall in the grand scheme of American politics. And unfortunately, we get the result is that by not voting for ideas, you don't get ideas debated in presidential election cycles.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about that back with Larry too, in terms of the importance of third parties, and that makes a lot of sense to me. I guess, how frustrating is it for you? Because I guess I shouldn't presume it's frustrating for me that, like, you have to get into the system if you want to change, right? You have to get on the debate stage, and these two major parties
I have to get on your podcast.
Well, I mean, I wish that was true. I mean, someday I hope that is true. But like, it is a lot of these smaller things that you are graciously taking the time to do, and I appreciate that. But if you want to scale these ideas, you have to be part of the system to some extent, and the people that run the system are determined to keep people like you out of the system. So like that vicious cycle, I'm not sure. It's super frustrating for me to sit back and see it happen and not know that there's a solution to it.
I get that. I think there is a solution to it. I don't know what the solution is. There are candidates for solutions. I don't know that there are solutions for candidates, but there are things out there that might work. One of those things is that eventually the Libertarian Party becomes more influential. First, by getting enough votes to, in effect, force the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, preferably, hopefully both, to take into consideration our voters, therefore take into consideration our ideas, right? And move in our direction. The second way that can work is the Libertarian Party eventually becomes powerful enough to actually rival candidates in an election. Short of that, the way that this would have to work is for a libertarian-minded candidate, lowercase l, libertarian-minded candidate, to play a major role inside the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. Another way, and there are examples, right, on the margins. There are big, important examples. You know, you've got your Thomas Masseys and Rand Pauls and Ron Pauls of the world, but you've also got examples where administrations have been deeply affected by libertarian ideas in the past, not just Ronald Reagan. So these things do matter. And then the last thought I would offer for you is the possibility that in the future, the major political parties, possibly all parties of which we're aware today, could be viewed as dinosaurs in a relatively brief period of time. By relatively brief, I know you two are young men, but to me, 20 years is a relatively brief amount of time. One could easily imagine 20 years from now, you having to explain to your children just how important the Republican Party and the Democratic Party once had been. Because the way this is going to eventually pan out, this is only a possibility. I make no pretense to being able to predict the likelihood. But if we can move state legislatures in a direction of making ballot access easier, that seems unlikely. Or more likely, a large number of billionaires who want to participate in the political process, a la Nicole Shanahan. You could imagine that ballot access efforts rallied around particular candidates becomes more important than the extant infrastructure of the Republican Party, the Democratic Party.
Yeah, we again, we're both totally on board with reform like that, and I think in some ways that does seem to be our best hope. I'm curious to go back to something you kind of alluded to earlier, where you said, at least for the first 6 months of this presidential race, we had the candidates for the two major parties that were historically unpopular. And it seemed like, and Ricky and I did some episodes on this at the beginning of the year, that this was an election cycle ripe for third-party candidates. RFK obviously being the most prominent, not only because of his name, but also because of like the big dollar donors behind him. But it also seemed like opportunities for people like you and Chase, for people like Jill Stein and Cornel West to really gain some traction here and pull off significant portions of votes in ways that we haven't seen since maybe Ross Perot. Like, I think that was maybe a hope that I had, at least, that we would see kind of what you were saying, enough of a presence that would force whoever won to kind of to embrace or at least deal with this kind of the third party. Why do you think that we haven't really seen that now that we're, less than 2 months from the election?
Right. And we don't know yet exactly how this is going to play out, because I still believe that Chase and I are very likely to get several percentage vote because people really do no longer want to waste their vote. They really do want to push American politics in a direction that makes more sense toward reform and away from the duopolistic structure that we have. And RFK possibly as well, even though he's trying like hell to get himself off of a bunch of ballots, which is a little creepy to watch, actually. But to your point, Chase and I are not swimming in money, right? We're not swimming in poll results at the moment that would knock your eye out. So I get your question. I think it's for a couple of reasons. One is that the candidates, and this is a bit of irony that goes to your initial proposition that the two candidates were relatively unpopular in a historic sense, yeah. Right? I'm not old enough to remember Andrew Jackson. I know I look like it, but I query whether these two, Joe Biden and Donald Trump, those two, are really the least popular presidential candidates we've ever had. That's quite a statement, right? But certainly they're the most unpopular that we can remember. But it's a very different media environment than it was certainly for Andrew Jackson and James Buchanan and Andrew Johnson. But I would also argue it's a very different media environment than it was for Richard Nixon. I query whether and I mean no disrespect, because I know there's still a lot of Richard Nixon fans out there, but I query whether if Richard Nixon were running today, if he might not be more divisive than he was viewed at the time. And I think my point is that when our media really bifurcated, when our electronic media really bifurcated in the 80s, starting with cable and then with the advent of the internet, it gave up on this idea that you had to reach across the aisle, right? And it's all about playing to your base. It's all about getting out the vote of your base. It's all about raising as much money as you can from your base. That's what everything, and along with that, who can say the most horrific things about your opponent? Right? I mean, that's what it's all about. And you have to admit that whereas the Republican Party, the Democratic Party used to have political agenda that made some sense. Most of my family are Democrats who joined that party with a feeling that that's a party that would stand up for your civil liberties, that would stand up for your First Amendment rights, that would stand against government censorship, right? You do you. That's not the Democratic Party. In fairness, that's not the Democratic Party anymore. You march in lockstep with that party, or you are out, and far out. That's just the truth of the matter. And censorship is what they're all about every day for lunch. The Republican Party, as you and I discussed earlier, is not the Republican Party of 25 years, 30 years, 35 years ago. It's just not. Each of those parties has left behind their agenda. Their number one priority is what? Keeping the other side out of power. This is where authoritarianism comes from in a democracy. In a democracy anywhere on the globe, this is where it comes from. It comes from the idea that you can leverage people's fear into voting for you if you can convince people that what you really have to fear is not the loss of your civil liberties or even the loss of your money. What you really have to fear is that other idiot coming to power. And I'm here to save you. That's what it's all about.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of those like sad but true statements there. And I'm just, nodding along. So I guess to put it, what I'm hearing you say is even though this environment on the surface seemed ripe for third party candidates, what the two parties have done so effectively is fearmonger to make people say that I need to vote for my guy or my girl because I can't allow that girl or that guy to be in power.
If you're a Democrat, you hear all day, if you watch CNN, as I do, and you should feel sorry for me, if you watch CNN for an hour a day, like I force myself to, it's a heavy burden. By the way, if anyone is watching, they should send my campaign money so I feel better because I have to force myself to watch CNN. I watch Fox every day as well. If you watch CNN, you are told constantly that if you don't support, they don't say it explicitly, although sometimes they have guests on who say it explicitly. If you don't support Kamala Harris, it's going to be your fault if Trump comes to power and he is a threat to democracy. And you just flip those nouns around, and that's what you hear on Fox.
Yeah.
It's very hard to walk away from electronic media these days thinking you have an ethical option to vote for a third party because everyone is telling you that it's your responsibility to save our democracy by voting for their favorite candidate.
But I guess maybe to end on I don't know if there's an optimistic view of this, but it really does feel like we're in this, some kind of a spiral downward where all of the data or whatever just shows that the more negative campaign you can run, the more you can just paint the other side as the doomsday. And as long as you're focused on the other side, it doesn't actually matter what I'm doing as a candidate or what I believe in. It's very hard to say really what either candidates believe in outside of some niche issues that they focus on. What do you see as like how do we get out of this? Or maybe, more broadly, like why are you part of this? Why are you running?
To work backwards, I don't think that if you know, as I do, as I believe I know, that the federal government is going to collapse and that we are in a downward spiral, I do not feel as though I have, ethically speaking, I do not feel I have an option to do nothing. I think that's a problem. I don't think watching is a responsible alternative, right? But to your point, what do you do about it? Look, I often say the great battle of the past 100 years has been between freedom and socialism. I believe that that's true. I do not believe that will be the great battle going forward. I believe that this is going to be resolved one way or another in the next few decades. And I very much fear it is going to be resolved not the way that it should be in the best interest of humanity. When the government collapses, it can go one of two ways. This is a knife's edge, in my view, from our perspective in 2024. The lesson can be, oops, too much government spending leads to collapse. We better not do that again. The lesson I had hoped everyone would learn from the collapse of the Greek government a couple decades ago. People did not learn that lesson. Alternatively, people could learn the opposite lesson, which is democracy just doesn't work. That Vladimir Putin was right, that authoritarianism works, democracy doesn't, because you can't trust people to elect officials who make decent decisions. And in the long run, you need an autocrat.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're already unfortunately starting to see the seeds of that, and this is where, I mean, certainly pushed by countries like Russia and China that see this as really an opportunity, potentially an inflection point where you can the West that won in the 20th century, there might be looking a little bit weak, not only in the United States but across the Western world, Western democracies recently. Mike, you've been super generous with your time. I got just one or two more things for you. You said at one point earlier in our conversation that these two parties have convinced their base to waste their vote and continue to vote for these two parties, and vote for these people for the next 4 years as opposed to ideas. Lots of people would kind of lob that criticism right back at you and Chase and other third party candidates and say, we are wasting our vote. You are wasting your vote if you vote for Chase Oliver and Mike-ter Maat when we have an election that's so close like this. How do you respond to something like that?
If you do not vote for your ethics and your values and your principles and the policies that you want, the change that you want, then you are truly wasting your vote, because when you vote for a Republican, you are sending the signal that you believe that the Republican Party is on the right track. And similarly, if you vote for a Democrat, you're telling that party that it is on the right track. And now, if you believe that, then, good for you, cast that vote.
Yeah.
But if you believe that we do need change, then you need to do what it is that you can to force that change, to bring that change, to force whatever party might have otherwise gotten your vote to move in the direction of change. Otherwise, you'll be faced with a similar choice 4 years later, and you'll have no one to blame but voters themselves. You'll have only yourself to blame for not getting any change. That's a tall order, right? Asking people to vote for long-term change is a tall order. Asking people to vote for ideas is a long-term order, and a tall one. And I wonder, knowing that this is coming to a head, not in 24, probably not in 28, but as Humphrey Bogart once said, soon and for the rest of your life. I don't know exactly when, right? Maybe 2032, maybe 2036, but at some point it's going to get real. And it'll be late. You will get people voting in a very different way, because you'll have to vote for the party that is more likely to stave off the impending collapse. I don't know exactly what that looks like, right? What that late stage sort of end game politics looks like. To your earlier question, I think that it is up to politicians who do not believe in the duopolistic system, and specifically politicians who do not believe in allowing the government to spend this much money, to do something about it. And I believe that that means trying to work from the outside and drawing the parties, knowing that the party's relative power may be a passing thing. But alternatively, I would encourage politicians to try the other avenue. I can't do both, but politicians need to try the other avenue, which is to work inside the Democratic Party, work inside the Republican Party, and try to move those parties in the right direction. For example, one could easily imagine either party, come to think of it, one could imagine either one of the major two parties having, well, especially if Trump wins on November 5, one could easily imagine there being quite a fight inside of each of those parties that is deeply ideological, not merely on a practical level, but deeply ideological, because neither party is particularly adherent to one philosophy or another at the moment. One could imagine quite a food fight going on. And I do believe that there is a libertarian lane inside of each of those parties. I don't think it's a coincidence that Kamala Harris used the language of freedom recently. I believe she's bastardizing that term a little bit, but good for her for giving it a shot. It's not like Donald Trump uses words, like he's not using words in weird ways too. So I don't mean to pick on her in particular. I do think that there'll be a libertarian lane inside the Republican Party that, to the conversation you and I had earlier, that fights against the idea of tariffs and the government spending too much money. And by the way, neither party is doing a very good job right now. Neither candidate is doing a very good job right now of reflecting what a whole lot of Americans are thinking, which is that our foreign policy is full of crap. And not merely in an ethical sense, but in a practical sense. And there are a lot of youngsters who look at this ethically, right? And say, we just don't like war. Now, that's been a phenomenon for 100 years. Young people haven't liked war as an ethical proposition. But it is also true that people with as much gray hair as I have are waking up to the fact that as a practical matter, our foreign policy hasn't worked very well. There are not really examples that you can point to recently, and by recently, I mean since like the 50s, and say, oh yeah, that cost us some billions of dollars and a few thousand lives, but it was a good idea. That was worth it. That achieved what we wanted to achieve in a long-term strategic sense. I'm glad we did that. I'm glad I paid for that.
No, yeah, I know. The only one that comes to the top of my mind is the George W. Bush PEPFAR, like the AIDS in Africa money that we've sent, which was great, and I think it was just on the cutting room floor because no one wants to pay for it anymore. So what are we even
Nobody
doing
wants
here?
to pay for that anymore. And some people argue that Clinton did a good job in Kosovo, and some people argue the administration did a good job in Korea. But the truth of the matter is that there aren't a lot of people pointing at those examples and saying, that's why we should excuse what happened in Afghanistan and Iraq.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's totally fair.
Yeah,
Mike,
maybe we screwed up Iraq, but Clinton did a good job in Kosovo. That is not a conversation. That's not how this works.
And it shouldn't be. Like, realistic shouldn't be. Those are not on the same level of things.
No, they're not. And I think that most people are not aware. Back to our conversation about the media, I don't think most people realize that it wasn't billions of dollars that we lost in Iraq and Afghanistan. It was trillions. And I don't think that most people realize that it wasn't thousands of lives lost in Afghanistan and Iraq. It was over 1 million.
Yeah.
And, directly and indirectly, a lot more than 1 million. This is a big deal. This isn't just, we made a mistake kind of stuff we're talking about. This is very fundamental to who we are as a nation, and we shouldn't be putting up with a foreign policy that does such a bad job of reflecting our values.
That's where this is going to get Ricky going on this point. This is Mike. You started off kind of preaching to me. You're going to end preaching to Ricky. So this is well done, Mike. If people are done with like the economic policies of these two candidates or the foreign policy of these two candidates, they're interested in what you just said, where should they go to learn more?
Well, you can learn more at a couple of different places. You can go to votechaseoliver.com, which is not too hard to spell. That's why I often point out that votechaseoliver.com. You can go to Oliver-ter-Maat.com. That's a little bit trickier to spell because there's 2 A's in Termat. So you can go to Oliver-ter-Maat.com. You can make a donation in either place. You can also sign up if you want to give us a hand. We are not, we have quite literally hundreds of volunteers, but I can tell you right now, I'm looking for more volunteers for very specific projects. So if anyone, wanted to get involved and play a role and do something that might be kind of fun and out of the ordinary for the next 50 days, or, if you had either $50 or $2,550 in your pocket, you can get rid of it at the websites. And I can tell you, and this is the truth, being a campaign that's not awash in cash, anyone who makes a donation, that money goes to good use. It does not go to our 700th Facebook ad of the week, right? That's not how this works. These are dollars that actually keep Chase and me on the road, or else the campaign comes to a screeching halt. Your money actually would be deeply appreciated.
Beautiful. And your time is deeply appreciated, Mike. This was a super fun conversation. You've been super generous with your time, but you've given us plenty to think about and to talk about, and we really appreciate you.
Thank you. Thanks for your time. I look forward to being with you again. And I'm heartened to know that you guys don't really argue as much as you would like to claim. I'll keep your secret safe, though. I know you don't want your audience to find out that you actually get along.
Oh, yeah,
Thank you.
I don't even know. Touche. That's where we're landed. Yeah. All right. Thanks, Mike.
Take care. Bye-bye.
So once again, thank you so much to Chase and Mike for being so generous with their time. Ricky, I just want to reiterate how lucky we feel to be able to have those conversations with people like this. And as I said at the end of Chase's interview, really, I genuinely thank people like Chase and Mike for doing what they do, right? Like, how often on this podcast over the past 4 years have we bemoaned the lack of choice that we have as voters and the hegemony of the two-party system. And Chase and Mike see that, and they have spent so much of their own time and resources into trying to give voters a different choice, a different option. And I hope that in listening to the interviews, people are intrigued, inspired, or want to look into them more, to look into third-party candidates more up and down the ballot, whether presidential or, as Chase and Mike said, a lot of this is local too, where you can start looking beyond two parties for candidates that are beyond on the ballot in November. We leave these interviews, and oftentimes, and normally we would have our instant reactions. We talk to our guests, and then you and I react to it. This is slightly different in the sense that we've had a few days away from our conversation with Chase and over a week away from our conversation with Mike. So curious briefly if there have been any things that have stuck in your head about things that you maybe agreed with, that you're like, man, that idea has really stuck with me, things that you disagreed with, questions that you wish that we could have asked. Now that you've had some time to reflect, Ricky, what are your thoughts on those conversations?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I recall from just a few days ago talking with Chase and even with Mike as well, nodding my head along to a lot of the things that they said. So naturally the the question is am I a little bit libertarian now? And
all right, coming around.
And I mean, I think that they put some arguments out there that would be very difficult to disagree with. I find that their approach, the way Chase was describing his approach to foreign policy, that he's interested in truly being a diplomacy first, military intervention, absolute last resort kind of candidate, which I wholeheartedly believe is needed, and neither party provides right now, right? So there's some things like that where I found myself being like, wow, yeah. And then if even just taking a step back, and you were sort of talking about how much they've invested of themselves to kind of bring forth these ideas that are separate from the other two parties. And yeah, I think maybe even just starting there, commending them on saying, neither of these parties feel like they're representative of what we think the country needs. And okay, we're going to go out and forge a sort of a different path. And I find that super refreshing and so much more optimistic than resigning ourselves to candidates that we don't like.
Yeah, for sure. And as Chase kind of said, if he was up there on the debate stage, it would have just been a very different debate than the debates that we had gotten. It would have been more policy focused, and that I think would have benefited everybody. that's not the situation right now. So what they're trying to get their message out any way they can, and through podcasts like this, and they're out hustling. That's what you have to do as third party candidates. I think one of the things that always is interesting about these third party candidates, libertarians in particular, but I mean, you could say this for the Green Party or other parties like this, where because you have the dominance of the two parties, you can go and pitch the ideas that maybe appeal to the more Democratic leaning voters and emphasize those issues. And then you go to the Republican leaning voters and you pitch ideas that appeal to them. I think traditionally libertarians would go to Republicans and talk about Second Amendment rights. They would talk about, again, traditionally free trade and economic issues. And then you go over to the Democratic leaning people and you talk about the right to marry who you want, the right to make your own choices about like your body and your healthcare decisions and like those sorts of things, maybe foreign policy traditionally, and there's some freedom in that, right? I think what I was thinking, Chase was talking about this with his his platform on education, where he is like, would my system be perfect? No, but the current system is even worse. And I think that's what kind of how I'm thinking about the parties here, where like, do you and I agree with everything that Chase and Mike were saying? No, but do we agree with maybe more than we would Kamala Harris or more than we would Donald Trump? Maybe.
I mean, certainly on certain issues, which,
Right.
it does continue to bring up like, all right, well, how are other countries doing this? And so many other places they allow for these divisions within parties, and then, or yeah, I mean, like saying that the left is sort of one thing and the right is another. They allow for further subdivisions within them, and then the forming of these like alliances, and
Yeah.
for better or for worse, that it operates differently. But one of the nice things that you get from that is that you're allowed to be a socially conservative Democrat or a fiscally or like a more fiscally liberal Republican, right? Like you can have, you can chew gum and walk at the same time kind of thing. You're like allowed to hold two thoughts in your head, and they don't necessarily have to be in conflict, and you can find different people in different places that agree or disagree. And one of the things that Chase said that really stuck with me too about why he is running, and it's such a refreshing, like non-selfish motive, when he said that, like, hey, on the bright side, if I say something that gets some traction somewhere and one of the major presidential tickets picks it up and it somehow makes it into policy, like, great.
Better for everyone.
That's a huge win for me, which, like, in terms of other things that we've discussed and how closely people guard, policy victories as just political capital, because for the most part, between Democrats and Republicans, it's just beating the other side. Like, the actual advancement of the country or of like good policy is very much a second order thing. Like, that just notion of, I think there are certain good ideas that we're not acting on that I could put out there into the space, and maybe enough people would be interested in them that somebody would do something about it.
Yeah, and I think for one thing that Mike said that stuck with me, and kind of to your first point, is look, both Chase and Mike said in an ideal world, we would win and there'd be libertarians in the White House and the executive branch. But there are other ways to win. And one of the ways Chase said is exactly what you just brought up, in terms of if we can get some of ideas just adopted or even in the conversation, then that's a win. But Mike said you hope that some libertarian leaning Democrats kind of come up through the Democratic Party, or libertarian leaning Republicans come up. And that's more, I think, what you're saying, where we could have just different wings and factions within parties that even then, while maybe not the libertarian ideal, would be helpful for providing options and providing just even different kind of like groups of people or caucuses that you could form within the government. So look,
And
I think
it wouldn't be like automatically political suicide, which it is today, right? Like, you do anything
cross the aisle.
cross the aisle, and you're just opening yourself up to a primary challenge, which ends your, has very often kind of ended your time in government.
Yeah. So I guess that's my takeaway. I think we put it to both of them. You did a really nice job at the end of Chase's interview, just being what does success look like? And yeah, in the grand scheme of things, as Chase said, he was like, damn, I would love to be president because I think that I could do a lot of good. And I appreciate obviously he spent so much time, he and Mike have spent so much time. They, as he said, you're in it to win it, right? That's the goal. But success can also take a lot of different forms, as both of them acknowledged. And you hope as they continue to have conversations like this and they get their message out to more and more people, they will have success in various forms come November. And so I guess like that's my takeaway. They push me to take a closer look at them, a close look at their ideals, but not only that, look across the spectrum of candidates at the national level and down the ballot on local levels of let's if Ricky, we say that we want other options, Mike and Chase are saying there are other options. You just got to go look for them. So as we're kicking down like the home stretch here, as people are really digging into like political and election season, I guess I would just encourage people to not only educate yourselves generally, but to really try to push yourselves to look beyond the two-party system. And ultimately, if you go with the Democrat for president or the Republican for Senate, whatever, like that, if that's the best candidate, fine. But I hope that we, as Mike and Chase said, stop voting out of fear of the other guy and vote for people and ideas that we believe in.
Yeah. I think that's totally right. I mean, I'd say like at the end of the day, if you're looking at a ballot and your calculus is telling you that I have to vote whichever way, Democrat, Republican, Libertarian, Green, if there is an option, right, and whatever it is, that as long as you're voting your conscience, you're not going to regret that decision. And I think that this narrative of fear around, well, if a vote for the Libertarian is a vote for Donald Trump, or it's a vote for Kamala Harris, whatever it is, right, is something that we've been living with. I remember it all the way back to George Bush and Al Gore, which is really like the first election that I genuinely remember. And they were saying that about Nader. And I think the actual truth is, and I've to come to this conclusion, is that we have 150 million people voting out of a voting population of 200 plus, which means that if some election is decided by 10,000 votes and those 10,000 went to a Libertarian, it wasn't one candidate or another who those votes were stolen by, because there were still another 30, 40,000 uncast ballots out there that could have been won over with better ideas, better outreach, better policy, whatever. So people should vote their conscience, or we're going to continue to get this absolute cluster, which we are. I mean, as voters, right, to some degree, we have no one but ourselves to blame. And when we're getting other options, we should consider them and consider them thoughtfully. That doesn't mean that we have to go for them, but consideration is warranted in these ever so important decisions.
Well said, Ricky. That's a great place to leave it. For all our loyal listeners, as always, we really appreciate you. We hope you enjoyed these conversations. We always welcome feedback. You can reach out to us on our Instagram, _gentlemen's_disagreement. For the new listeners, thank you so much. We hope you liked what you heard. We've had some tremendous guests on the past. We hope you check out. As part of that, we recently launched our YouTube channel where we've uploaded some of our best interviews from the past. Just this last week, we uploaded one with an Irish professor, Larry Donnelly, who we recorded with in the wake of the October 7th massacre in Israel. And we uploaded our interview with Chesa Boudin, the former San Francisco district attorney. We have so many great interviews now on the YouTube, so encourage people to go check that out. And then I guess one final thank you to Chase and Mike and Gabby, who coordinated all of this on behalf of them. Ricky, this is why we do stuff like this, right? That we get to talk to people like Chase and Mike and appreciate them as people and the work that they're doing. And yeah, I feel very grateful.
As do I. Yeah, 4 years in, who'd have thought we would be talking to some presidential candidates?
Look at us. Look at us. Who would have thought?
All right. That's no better place to leave it than there. Till next time, buddy.
I'll see you.
What I wouldn't hope I used to find in a case of lion's head. Folks of different minds, because even though we did not share the pains we share, that American ideal, friends made over arguments in an early morning buzz. Need an early morning buzz.